Welcome to Road to the Great British Bake Off.
I got itty bitty cupcakes.
My name's Shelley. I'm a really amateur baker.
Probably not a successful bake.
And I'm spending 2021 working my way through Bake Off challenges. Every month, I'm tackling a theme, like Cake Week or Bread Week, using real tasks and technicals, and holding myself to the same time limits as past contestants. It's just like preseason training. So join me, and let's see what happens. Welcome back. So today you can see I'm not in my kitchen, I'm in my living room, doing things a little bit differently today. I decided not to film today's bake, but rather photograph it because it's not an official GBBO challenge. This is just an extra bake I decided to do for fun, to give me some practice, and actually it was meant to be, and I guess it wasn't meant to be, it actually turned out to be a wee thank you cake for a client that I had recently. And what I wanted to do was to create a design inside cake where every slice would have their brand logo in it vertically. The cake is a bit of a hybrid recipe, a spice cake that I added a kind of orange twist to it. So it's really an orange spice cake. And here's the recipe, the ingredients list, and the steps I went through. Cake flour, baking powder, baking soda, the spices, nutmeg, cinnamon, clove, salt, unsalted butter, sugar, eggs, either yogurt or buttermilk, oranges, fresh oranges if you can, as opposed to orange juice, Cointreau, cream of tartar, and that's it. So I started off with the liquid ingredients. I zested 2 oranges using just a cheese grater, and then squeezed the fresh orange juice into a measuring jar until I had about half a cup. There's a little bit of kind of eyeballing on this part of the recipe. I then added 1 tablespoon of Cointreau, and then topped up the difference to reach the 3/4 cup of liquid measure with buttermilk. After I did that, I colored it. I needed some layers that were going to be the logo blue. So I used my food coloring to get it up to the blue that I thought I needed it to be. Meanwhile, in a bowl, I sifted together the cake flour, baking powder, baking soda, and spices and salt. If you want a milder spice flavor in your cake, I would have the nutmeg, cinnamon, and clove measurements that I provided you. I actually have tripled what the original recipe called for in my recipe because I've made this batter before. And when I made it with the original quantities, it barely tasted like spice at all to my palate. The next step was to beat until creamy for about 30 seconds the unsalted butter, so 1.5 sticks. And once it was kind of creamed, I added in on high speed until lightened the 1 1/4 cup of sugar. And once that was mixed in well, I added in 3 large egg yolks, one at a time. Then it was time to merge the ingredients. So you add the flour mixture in 3 parts, alternating with, in 2 parts, the orange juice liquid. So I added 1/3 of my flour to the mixing bowl set on low, added half of my orange juice mixture, added my next 1/3 of my flour mixture, added the remainder of my orange juice mixture, and then added my final 1/3 of flour mixture till it was mixed well enough. In another large bowl, I beat on medium speed 4 large egg whites with 1/8 teaspoon cream of tartar. And once I had the soft peaks, I gradually added in the 1/4 cup of sugar on high speed, beating until the peaks were stiff but not dry. And then I used a rubber spatula to fold 1/4 of the egg whites into my batter mixture and then folded in the remaining whites, scraping obviously the sides as I went to make sure it was spread evenly, which was a little bit tricky given that I was working with a blue cake. It's the first time I've used color batter and the kind of egg white foam cake style. It's a bit tricky getting the all the white to hide. And then I scraped the batter into my pan, which was a greased and lightly floured pan. Because it was a bigger cake, used a baking nail in the center to ensure that the center of the cake heated and cooked through in the allotted time. And then I baked it at 160 for, it was about 45 minutes on the rack that's just below center. Once it's finished, let it cool in the pan on the rack for 10 minutes and slide a knife around the outside edge of it to detach it. And then invert it and let it cool until it's fully cooled. So I repeated this process 4 times in total so I could have 4 separate cakes. Obviously my plan was that the logo was going to appear in the interior and I would have lots of wastage. But once I had the cakes baked and I'd seen how much they'd risen and I was looking at the proportions of the logo and I was trying to figure out how I was going to make this work within the cake, in the end I just couldn't figure it out. I didn't feel that the cakes were tall enough in order to get the ratios right without me having to have very fine gaps of white cake between them, which I just didn't think was going to be realistic without it breaking and looking a hot mess between each vertical line. So I switched plans and decided just to use, or rather just to make, a regular old layer cake. The drawback to that was that I had a shit ton of cake. The most cake I have ever had in my life in my kitchen. And that meant I needed an awful lot of icing. But this is the recipe that I followed. The default recipe makes about 1 cup of icing, and it's just a quick white icing, which calls for 2 cups of powdered sugar, sifted, 4 tablespoons or half a stick of unsalted butter, softened obviously. And then I used Cointreau again for flavoring, vanilla, and a little bit of salt. The first batch I made, I actually doubled the recipe, thinking surely that'll be enough to ice a cake. But as you can see from this photograph, I was wrong, because this is a picture of where I got stuck because I ran out of frosting. Every layer that I iced was actually iced pretty thinly because I was trying to make it last, and it still didn't cover the 4 cakes because they were such monsters. They're so big. So I made another double batch thinking that'll see me through, but it didn't. It was enough to cover the top layer and get about halfway through the crumb coat on the outside. And in the end, I was getting so frustrated with having to remake icing that I ended up doing 2 more triple batches just to make sure that I had enough. And then I ended up with more than I needed in the end, which went into the freezer. So I iced the inner layers of each cake. I gave it a crumb coat. I set aside into an icing bag some of the plain white frosting. It was actually kind of yellowy from all the butter, but the white frosting to do the outside layers, because what I wanted to do is have a striped effect. Almost, I thought the striped effect would be a bit tidier than it was, as in more discrete lines, but in the end it was almost like a balayage. So I set that aside for the white lines, and then the next batch I started adding the blue dye to. And basically I added a bit of the blue food coloring to get it the lightest color, starting at the top. When I liked that shade, I stuck it into the piping bag, piped that line, did a white line, squeezed what was left of the icing from the piping bag back into the bowl, added a bit more food coloring to darken it down, scooped that out into the piping bag, put that line of frosting onto the cake, put a line of white onto the cake, squeezed what was in the bag that was blue back into the bowl, added a bit more dark food coloring, and continued that process until I had all of my lines alternated with all of my white. And then I got to use my fancy new, what do you call it, turntable to smooth it all together. And this is how it came out. So it was a monster of a cake. It was 4 9-inch cakes. Once, when all stacked, was 7 inches tall, took up the majority of a dinner plate, and weighed a ton. I didn't even measure it. But it did taste really good. And I think it would have been even better if I had sifted my flour in advance. It would have been a lighter cake. It was tasty and it was heavy. It was a dense cake, but it was good. So I would definitely recommend the recipe. Just don't screw up the sifting. And maybe don't do 4 9-inch cakes unless you're planning to give it away to everybody that you know, which is what I did. So there you go. Successful bake overall in terms of flavor and look. I'm happy with it. Disappointed that I couldn't figure out the interior design inside element, but maybe I'll try that again another time.